Okay. So thank you everyone for being here today. So the paper I'm going to present today is called Disability in Retirement, Home Production and Informal Insurance Between Spouses. So this is a work I've been reworking on recently, so there are a few changes from the previous version, and this is still a work in progress. So I will start by a quotation. So a lot of the life cycle models in retirement have actually been focused on the behavior of single households, but actually not really any of them has been looking at how the couples actually in the structural estimation of these models affects behaviors. And as said by Bertrand and Jones in a recent literature review, couples actually might be a little bit different from singles because they face two sets of health and medical expense risks, but at the same time they can pool both their risks and assets. And there is also something in addition that they may also be able to partially self-insure by using the time of the healthier spouse to take care of the sick spouse if you have one. So what I'm going to do here is actually build in a life cycle model of retired household the channels that you have here. So what is done is that I introduce this self-insurance channel and also the different risks that households face within a life cycle model of elderly households. And actually the way I do it is through the presence of home production. So as you're going to see, what you see when you look at home production of retired households is that when you have health shocks, actually the time spent on health production by one of the members actually falls a lot. But the reaction of usually the healthy spouse increase in some way its own production as well. So it's kind of a way to look at how people are able to perform instrumental activities of daily living throughout their life course. So that's why I introduced this. And actually a novelty that was not in the previous versions of this paper is that now I introduce an endogenous mobility into nursing homes, because typically what you observe is that people for a given health state, if you're in a couple, you're actually less likely to be in a nursing home. So I'm going to introduce that. So quantitatively, it doesn't fit really because I've not matched it yet. I didn't have time to do that, but you will see that actually the model is able to deliver qualitatively this pattern that if you're in a couple, you are less likely to be in a nursing home than if you're a single household. So why that might be important to take into account these features of the couple. The first thing is that, and that's why I include nursing home, is that it might delay nursing homes and nursing home entry. And as you know, to enter into nursing home is actually quite costly. So it might reduce in some way the need for savings, but as the Bertrand Jones also said, the thing is that you have two risks at the same time. So it's not really clear what is going to dominate, and that's why actually I wanted to build this model. So also what you could deal with in this model is actually you could include policies that might actually help delay nursing home, for instance, by providing higher Medicaid payment when you are in a couple and your spouse can take care of you. That might be actually a cheaper way to take care of you. Also, it may be interesting to take into account these different channels if you want to evaluate the benefits of long-term care insurance on our annuities. So what the model actually is aimed at replicating, so you've got elderly saving behavior, which is the first component and usually what you try to match in life cycle models. The second is a response of home production to the deterioration of your own health and also to the deterioration of the health of your spouse. And I'm going to show you some pictures about this later on. And the last fact that I want to reproduce, I've not done it yet, but you will see I included it now, so quantitatively it doesn't fit, of course, but it's in the future I actually want to match quantitatively this feature. Now in the model is aimed at reproducing the fact that you have less probability for a given health state to be in a nursing home if you're in a couple than single. So just a little bit of literature, but I'm going to go relatively fast on this. So the life cycle literature in retirement has concentrated mainly on singles. So you have several papers by Bertrand and Jones, which I think a lot of you know about. You have also some works by Amerix et al. About bequest motives, and Lockwood also about bequest motives and long-term care insurance demand. And you have several other papers which I did not cite because the literature review could be quite long. And there has been few papers which actually have started to take into account informal care within these kind of models, but so far it's been concentrated on the health from children. So you can see that these are very recent papers. So you've got Deborah Quinn, Journal of Human Resources, Barjik and Kreidler, who actually look also at the health from children to elderly parents. So it's going to be in Review of Economic Studies, and there is also a working paper by Mom Myers on this, in which she also tries to explain the fact that usually if you have children, you might have a lower demand for long-term care insurance. So that's a channel that she includes as well. So now I'm going to present to you some empirical patterns that actually I'm trying to reproduce. Then I'm going to present a small part of the model, so I'm not going to bother you with too much equations. And then I'm going to go through some of the results here. So the first interesting pattern is the shocks that you observe to home production. So these are on the left panel here. You've got hours of home production done by women as a function of age and disability. So these are in hours per year. So you see that a woman healthy in the mid-60s spends about 1,200 hours on home production annually. So this is about 60% of the average time spent working by a US worker. So that's quite substantial. But you see that as a woman gets disabled, actually this hours of home production falls a lot and substantially, and it gets actually at the end, if you're very disabled and very old, usually close to zero. So you've got very large shocks on these dimensions. So men spend less time on home production. This is something that you actually would expect. But you see that the shocks are also substantial. So you go from about 600 hours annually if you're 65 and relatively healthy to about zero if you are highly disabled and above 90 years old. So you can see that you have large shocks to home production. So the data are from the US, they are from the Health and Retirement Study, and the Consumption and Activities May survey, which has been presented also yesterday. So about the endogenous reaction of home production to the disability of your spouse. So on the left panel, you've got hours of home production done by wife with the disability level lower than 1. So I got a disability measure going from 0 to 5. So 5 is very high disability and 0 is no disability. And so I plot the hours of home production done by the wife as a function of the disability of her husband. And what you actually see is that as your husband gets more disabled, usually you increase the hours of home production that you do. And the amounts are quite substantial as well. So here it's about 400 hours. And you've got a similar picture for men. So if your wife gets disabled, and actually what you're going to do is that you're going to increase your hours of home production in some way. So you've got two effects actually in which the couple actually helps in this way in instrumental activities of daily living is that, well, imagine first I'm a wife and I get a negative shock to my health, so I'm going to decrease my hours of home production. My husband is still doing some, so that actually insures me in some way against this shock, but at the same time it increases the hours of home production that it does. So you've got these two actually channels which are playing here. And so the last picture I want to show you about the empirics is that what you observe is that for a given level of disability, so here I take people with disability greater or equal to 4, the probability to be in a nursing home is actually lower if you're in a couple than if you're in a single, and this is true for any age. Okay, so this is something that, and you see that actually the percentage difference is quite substantial. So about here for men, it's about more than 10 percentage points, so that's quite substantial. So let me now go a bit through the model and the way I'm trying to model these different patterns. So the main features of the model, and I'm not going to go in all the details of them and not all the equations, but so the main idea is that retired households here can be singles or couples. And so you can transit from couples to singles, okay? So your spouse may die at some point in time, or you may die before you your spouse dies. So there is death shocks here. So the utility actually, and it's going to be the way, the kind of novelty here, is that it depends positively on our spend on production and spending. And typically the idea is that here the two may be substitutes, and actually the main substitute you think of when you have this kind of bad health shock is more home care or nursing homes. Okay? And so the way actually this health shock is going to affect the hours of home production you do is actually by increasing the cost of effort of doing home production. So typically if you got, again, you're in retirement here, so we're taking retired households. Typically you can either decide to do home production, so it's going to bring you some benefit because, well, you might live in a clean environment and so on, but also it's costly in terms of effort because you need to do some stuff. But as actually you get sicker, it becomes more painful to do that, and so you may cut on this, and actually you may need people to help you. So that's the way it's modeled. So each year in the model, a household must decide on how much to spend. So you've got, so it's also the desaving pattern. So if you want to desave your wealth, it's going to link to spending. You're going to decide on how much home production each member is going to perform. So this is also going to depend on spending, and this is going to depend on health. I'm going to go through it in a second. And then you're going also to decide if one or both members should go to a nursing home. That's actually a new feature of the model. So here actually the idea is that the nursing home brings another kind of technology, and then actually at some point it might be more beneficial to pay the cost of the nursing home and let one of the two go to the nursing home. So that's the way it is modeled here. And there is also a utility cost of going to the nursing home. So you want actually to avoid in some way the nursing home as well. So you need to have these trade-offs. So the risks that the retirees face in this model are mortality risk, health risk, so you might be in different health states, in different disability levels. There's also medical expense risk, which are pure medical expenditures, which actually cannot be substituted by the spouse. So you think that the spouse can help you in activities of daily living or instrumental activities of daily living, but you hardly think that actually your spouse may substitute for medication. So that's actually something we take into account here. And you've got also government insurance programs present to the presence of Medicaid, and actually the level of Medicaid here is dependent on the mobility state you're in. So if you're sicker, actually you may receive more money from Medicaid actually to pay for your home care and this kind of things. So this is actually the way the intratemporal part of the model is actually represented. So it's actually quite simple. So a couple household is going to maximize a utility which depends on two parts. The left part is a utility of the wife. The right part is a utility of the husband. Okay? So the utility of the wife depends on consumption positively, and depends negatively on hours of home production that she does. Okay? And this AF actually is affects the disutility to perform home production activities. So as you get sicker, what's going to happen is that this AF is going to move up. Okay? And there is a way actually to identify these shocks in a model, which is actually quite simple by measuring the difference in the ratio of hours of home production of the two spouses. So that's the way it is done here. So on the right side, you've got actually the utility of the husband, and actually it depends on the same components, so consumptions positively and hours of home production negatively. So our consumption is built on, so it's a home production kind of model, so it's a bit the idea of Becker that consumption depends on total hours of home production and actually how much the household spends. And the hours of home production is the sum of those done by the man and the woman. Okay, so here I assume similar productivities. You could actually include different productivities of hours of home production. That's just by including a parameter here, but it's actually a simple version here. I don't include that. And so then you decide how much consumption to share between the two members of the household. So that's the way it is done. So what happens if you got a negative shock, for instance, to AF? So imagine that a wife gets sicker. So what's going to happen is that this AF here is going to increase. So this is naturally for a given level of expenditure. So here I'm taking only the intratemporal part, so where expenditure are given. Of course, you can adjust expenditure. So imagine that expenditures are constant here. So what's happened is that hours of home production decline. But if the husband has the same AM, so if the health state of the husband does not change and this utility of doing home production does not change, it's going actually to increase his hours of home production here. Because you should equalize, because when actually the hours of home production of the woman go down, actually this lowers down CT, so this increases the marginal utility of consumption, so you should increase your marginal disutility of effort. So the husband should increase HM, so that's really the way it works. Apart from this, the model is then very standard. You allocate your savings through time, taking into account your probability of survival, your probability of being sick in the future. So this is totally standard afterwards. So this is really the main part of the model. So to summarize a bit what we have here, so being in a couple may actually reduce the needs for precautionary savings through two channels. So one is actually to reduce the needs for additional spending when at home to maintain well-being through the home production here performed by the healthy spouse. So this is the idea that actually being in a couple might reduce the needs for home care services. So if your spouse is at home and can help you, actually you're going to need less to spend on home care services, so this is going to reduce your needs for savings. And it might also reduce savings, as I said, because actually it may delay nursing home entry as it makes it easier to maintain a given level of utility. So of course, you need to put in parallel this advantage of being in a couple with, as I said, the coupling of risk that households face. So for instance, one important thing that you observe is that if you're a woman and you're age 90 plus, your probability to be in a couple is going to be 5%. So it's very low. And this is a time at which you have actually more shocks, and actually you might also have spent before because your spouse was sick also before, so you might end up with relatively little savings. So you've got this coupling of risk, which is quite high. And also one thing which I do not take into account, and link, I think, somehow to the next presentation, which is about endogenous health. Here, health is totally exogenous. But actually, if you do additional effort to help your spouse, that might deteriorate in some way your health. And what you do observe, for instance, because when I do actually estimate the transition probability matrices, what you observe is that the term of taking into account the disability of your spouse is actually affects negatively your health in the future health state. So this is taken into account in the model, but of course if you do policy analysis, this dimension is not going to change here, while maybe in reality actually that might change. So that's something to actually take into account. Something also I don't take into account here so far is the health from children, but actually that might be included in some exogenous way relatively simply by having actually an additional term here, which is help from family, and actually might happen with some probability. So you can do it actually in a probabilistic way. You can include help from the family, and that might also reduce your needs for saving and delay nursing home entry. So that's quite of a flexible model to do these kind of things. So now let me go through some of the results and actually what I'm trying to replicate. So here, this is the way the model replicates home production hours that you observe in the data. So the plain lines are going to be the model, and the dotted lines are going to be the data. So on the upper left panel, you observe hours of home production of women as a function of their age, okay, and for different levels of disability. So what you see is that the model can actually replicate the fact that hours of home production fall with disability and fall with age, okay? So here you've got a bit too much 0 hours at the median, because actually the model leads to too much nursing home entries. So that's why actually, so that's something I've not matched yet, so that's why actually you've got this feature here. Hours of home production by men, you also do observe that the model can actually fit quite well this pattern that you observe in the data as a function of age and disability. Also an interesting thing, and that's actually the way I I find the different weights in the household utility, is that what you do observe in the data is that if you're a woman and you're in a couple, you're usually going to spend more time on home production than if you're a woman and single. Okay? And you can do this controlling for health state and everything. This is something that you always find out, and you find actually the reverse for men, and the model can replicate that. Okay? So this is because you've got some effect of the weight and some effect of the different disutility of the husband and the wife, and this is going to lead to this. So then I also match the wealth patterns. So on the left panel, you've got for different income quartiles, the wealth as a function of age. So what you do observe is that the model can replicate the little decumulation of savings that you observe among retirees. Okay, so that's something that you try to match. You have a bit too much decumulation here, but globally it does a relatively good job. And you can also replicate the fact that actually as you get disabled, or actually your wealth also falls. So this is as a function of disability of women for low, moderate, and high disability states. Okay? And you have the same here for men. So you can reproduce this type of decumulation patterns. And this is important actually. Why a structural model can be helpful here is because you want to match this, but at the same time you need to take into account, and I do it in the distribution, initial distribution for the simulations, that if you're also sick, you might start with lower wealth. So that's also a way a structural model can control for this fact, that you might have an endogenous selection already at the beginning. Then here is going to, on the upper panel, you've got hours of home production of women as a function of the disability of their husband. So you see the model still fails a bit to reproduce this increase that we saw before, which is that as your spouse gets sicker, you increase your hours of home production. So the model doesn't generate still enough of this increase. And you see the same picture for men. But you still have this increase. So the model is kind of able, at least qualitatively, and at least explains part of the quantitative pattern that you do have in the data in terms of increasing home production hours. Okay. And so this is a feature of the model, so the new feature. So what do you observe in the model? So as I said, the numbers here are not quite right and are not matched to the, have not been matched to the data yet. And of course, this will maybe, this is something that I'm going to try to match. The probability to be in a nursing home when you're a man, here is as a function of age. You see that in the model it's lower if you're in a couple than if you're single. Okay, so typically through the presence of this help from your partner, which actually decreases the needs to go to a nursing home. And you've got the same picture for women. So remember, you had this picture before where you saw that being in a couple reduced for, and these are for people with very bad health. Okay, so these are with people which are very disabled. So with a disability level greater or equal to 4. So well, that's I think quite promising, and it's something that I'm quite happy to have here, is that you can reproduce that. So now the next step is to reproduce this quantitatively. And that leads me to the conclusion, because there's still, of course, a lot to be done. So this paper has introduced an additional self-insurance channel within a household through the time of the spouse into a life cycle model of retired households. So that's something which, to my knowledge, has not been done yet. So that's something a bit new. What it can replicate, it can typically replicate the wealth decumulation patterns as well as the home production patterns that you observe in the data. And it can reproduce the fact that the probability to be in a nursing home is lower if you're in a couple when disability is high. So typically, if you're very disabled, being in a couple reduces your probability to be in a nursing home. And so the next step is actually, as I said, to match the nursing home entry rates. One thing that I would like to do is especially study how actually the demand for long-term care what the demand for long-term care insurance is given actually this channel, because as I said, it's not clear what the effect is going to be, because you've got at the same time two types of health risk, but also you've got this kind of self-insurance channel. So what is going to be the final effect is going to be something which I think is an empirical matter rather than a theoretical one. And one thing that I may want to include, and actually as I said, it's not so difficult to do, is to include in some way the help from the family, to take into account that actually also this kind of help plays a role. Of course, if I do it here, so far it will be done exogenously rather than endogenously, because actually that would complicate matters even worse, and of course that's a limitation, but I think that's a good start to do this. So, well, thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm willing to take some of your questions. Thank you very much.